This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. This is episode number 217, and joining me on this episode is Kelsey McNair, founder and head brewer for North Park Beer Co. in San Diego, California. Welcome to the podcast, Kelsey.
Thanks, Jamie. It's great to be here.
We had a late night conversation at CBC, sitting on some couches at Death and Company over some cocktails.
Indeed.
And then the next day, we were sitting next to each other watching the GABF awards ceremony, in which you then won a silver medal in the hazy-IPA category and a bronze medal in the American imperial IPA category. A crazy feat to come away with two IPA medals in such different categories of IPA in 1 year. It was pretty remarkable. Can't wait to talk to you about how you pulled off that kind of dark magic.
I'm still in disbelief about it.
Well, I'm not in disbelief. I've tasted your beers. Beers like Infinite Content in the past scored a 96 with our blind judges here at Craft Beer and Brewing. Your barrel-aged beers have done well with our blind panel as well. Can't wait to delve into subjects that range from hoppy beer even to barrel aging. Before we do that, for nearly 30 years, G&D Chillers has set the mark for quality equipment you can rely on. G&D stands above the rest as the only chiller manufacturer that engineers your glycol piping for free. G&D stands alone as the only chiller manufacturer with an in-house team of installers and engineers with 30 years of real-world field labor experience in breweries, wineries, and distilleries. Contact the Total Glycol System Design experts today at gdchillers.com. Also, this episode is brought to you by our friends at BSG. We all know the best brewing results come from the best ingredients. BSG offers the largest variety of quality ingredients to create outstanding beers. BSG brings the best quality malt, hops, and additives from around the world to your brew house. Their knowledgeable and dedicated staff comes from the brewing industry and can assist you in product consultation for your recipe formulation. Contact your dedicated sales or customer support rep or become a customer at bsgcraft.com/be a customer. We are getting to the end of this year of the podcast. I want to send our appreciation and thoughts out to everyone who has helped us along this way, all the brewers that have appeared on it, and of course, all of our sponsors that have made it possible for us to bring you this. 2022 is looking great. We've got an amazing schedule lined up so far. We're going to Europe for the podcast, and most of our sponsors are coming on back. In 2022, we've got G&D Old Orchard, BSG, Pro Brew, SS Brewtech, and a whole bunch more that have come in again and are supporting bringing you these great brewing conversations. And so we want to express our appreciation to them. Kelsey, talk to me about your background in brewing. How did you get to a point now with North Park Beer? And you started out as a home brewer. I've read the PR stuff on all the Stone collabs that they did years and years ago. As you made a name for yourself on that homebrew world, you went pro, and here we are. But fill in all the gaps for me. Talk to me about how you made that kind of jump, where you got into beer, how you started brewing, how you caught the bug, and then how you decided to make a career out of it.
All right. So, I mean, even back in the end of high school, when all of the friends were drinking swill, thanks to somebody with a fake ID, I always wanted beer that had a little more flavor to it, and I'm not talking anything crazy, but I'd always say, get me something different. I don't want the Natty Light. I don't want the Ice House, go ahead and grab me something a little different. And, at some point, as I got a little older, I turned on to like Guinness and Newcastle, and I was like, oh, these beers have some flavor. It's actually, pretty good for what it was at the time. I was living in Tampa, Florida, and moved out to San Diego when I turned, I was 20 years old at that point. When I turned 21, living
Are you from Florida?
No, I was actually born just outside of Buffalo, New York. My
Okay.
dad was a high-profile demolition contractor. Moved around a little bit through my youth. Was in Houston for a stretch, and then Tampa before I moved. And landed in San Diego, where I've been ever since. Um, but yeah, I turned 21 in San Diego, and grocery shopping and deciding what to pick off the beer aisle. I knew I liked Guinness, and so I saw Old Rasputin Imperial Stout, and I was like, "Ooh, what's this?" And then I saw the ABV on it, and I was like, "Oh, wow, okay." And I brought that home, cracked it open, and I was totally blown away. Couldn't believe how much flavor was in that beer. And then the next time I went back to the store, stone arrogant bastard is sitting there on the shelf mocking me. I pick it up and I read the label and I'm like, okay, this is some ridiculous stuff right here. So I went ahead and bought it and I took it home, and I, again, kind of blown away by the flavor of that. Hadn't really had anything with that kind of bitterness at that point. Obviously had a Sierra Nevada somewhere cross my path, and the next thing I know, I'm like, okay, I got to find the beer store that has, all the stuff. I go to Bevmo and fill up the shopping cart, and I'm just trying all the styles I can. I start dating the woman who is now my wife. And I love to cook, had no culinary ambitions. It was Christmas 2003 that her office mate had bought for her husband a Mr. Beer kit that she saw. And at some point I casually dropped like, oh yeah, I might like to try home brewing someday. So I also got a Mr. Beer kit that year for Christmas, which I don't know a whole lot of brewers that are doing what I'm doing now that started on that. But
I talked to a lot, and many have.
yeah. Well, I ran through the motions on that thing once, and it was more about just like the allure of crafting the beverage and watching the fermentation and seeing a result that was, actually so shockingly palatable. Obviously not fantastic beer by any stretch, but I was amazed that I made something that I could actually consume. And it was even like that first time through it where I was just like, man, like I'm doing the wrong thing. At the time, I was a video game artist, which was a lot of fun, great career. But I also said, oh man, like this connects so many dots for me. Like it's creativity, it's it's that culinary itch that I have that So I ran on this little Mr. Beer kit and brewed a bunch of extract beer for a year, and my friends were all stoked and I was not. I was like, oh, these beers are all pretty much crap. And I hadn't done my homework, and so I said, you know what? I'm going to take a whole year off, and I'm just going to, digest as much information as I can. The Brewing Network had just, hit the scene. Jamil Zainasheff was sharing all of his wisdom. I learned that there was a great homebrewing community in San Diego, with one of the most successful homebrew clubs in the world, Quaff. And its membership is just amazing. Like so many good people in that club that I've, made great relationships and, have continued to connect with after all these years. I just started absorbing and going to breweries and asking questions and just trying to put things together. A friend of mine who I met through his blog, he's no longer a home brewer. His name's Johnny Lieberman. He's actually like a senior editor at Motor Trend. So he spends his time driving fancy cars these days. He had a blog that he was doing all kinds of ridiculous beers. And he did like here's all my equipment and here's how I built it. So that was my next step, was to graduate up, go all grain, have all the temperature control, do all the steps and procedures that commercial breweries were doing. And so, I applied all of that information, built this system. My first beer after my hiatus, I entered it in the national homebrew competition. And in the first round, it pulled me a bronze medal. It was a imperial IPA. And so that was very gratifying, after all this time, that my newfound knowledge, I could apply it and see some results. And that bug really sunk in. Like the second I pulled that first medal, I just was so hungry to keep, improving my beer. I wanted the unbiased feedback, but I also was chasing, the hardware just as much. So I kept that up. 2010 was really the pivotal year for me. Stone had their AHA rally that they have had pretty much every year. Low number of entries, but most of the entries in these contests were, imperial stouts, big adjunct beers, crazy stuff. What's going to really get, Greg Cook, excited to market this homebrewers recipe. And here I come in and enter a 4.2% session IPA, which wasn't even really a style at the time commercially. There were only a couple on the market. Locally, there was Even Keel from Ballast Point. But I was like, as a beer drinker, my affinity for hops, loving IPAs, I really was excited about that. Like, oh, this is the IPA I can drink 5 of, okay, this sounds cool. Like, and I put it into that contest, with minimal expectations, and they picked it, that was the winning beer for them. And I was just, on cloud 9 to, as the award to get to scale my beer up and have it distributed at the time into 23 states, which was met with a pretty incredible response. I mean, I'm reading all the Rate Beer reviews and Beer Advocate, and at the time it was just, it was huge. Same year, I'm entering the National Homebrew Competition, and Hop Fu, which was a recipe that I started tinkering with in 2006, wins me a gold medal on the national level, which that was equally as massive as winning Stone's contest. And it was kind of at that moment that I said, you know what, my IPAs evidently stand on a pretty big stage, so I need to figure out how to turn this into my life and not just my hobby. And that's kind of where the whole idea of North Park Beer Company came to life.
So you come up with this idea of going pro, but then there's a big gap, and especially, in 2010, 2011, I mean, that's still the front end of the kind of explosion that we saw in craft breweries in the 20 teens. Getting a brewery up and running, especially in a market like San Diego, not the easiest thing to do.
No, definitely not. And for me, it was a challenge because I had this great career in video games, and it was very stable, and I had great income. I was reluctant to step into brewing, and I know a lot of people are like, oh, I bootstrapped it, and I did, I fought tooth and nail to get up from the ground, and I gave up, everything. And I just said, you know what, I could dive into this head first, but I'm not a businessman. I work a career, and I'm a semi-accomplished homebrewer at this point, and I need more time. And I know that everybody says, oh, take the amount of capital you think you'll need and double it. I think really triple it. But I wanted to take the time to do it right, find the right location, make sure it was exactly where I wanted it to be. And my whole road was just catch-22s. I'm talking with a prospective landlord. I want to open a brewery. Okay, great. Well, where's your capital? Still working on that. Okay. And then I go fish for investors, and they're like, well, you've got a plan that's very location centric. Where's the space? And I just kind of kept running into this issue where it was a catch-23 where I could not make things line up. Eventually, I keep winning awards, and I keep pushing that boulder up the hill, and eventually, it gets to the top and it starts to roll, and then, it all came together. But it was rough. I mean, I would have loved to have seen this brewery open in 2012, 2013. And we didn't get open until June of 2016, and tons of breweries had opened in the meantime. So some of it was patience, some of it was just, difficulties, for sure.
It is a beautiful brewery space and a fantastic location. And it does seem like all of that came together for you. In full disclosure, we did actually have a brewery accelerator event there when we were in San Diego a few years ago. So we have been there, I've actually been there a few times. I haven't actually never connected with you while we were there, which is strange, but
I think that at that point in my,
this was still early days for you all. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so, after getting open, for 6 months, didn't hire a brewer. I had no assistant brewer. I had no salesperson. And so, I'm doing all of the beer production, all the cellaring. And if stuff needs to get delivered, I'm either leaning on my then taproom manager, or, delivering it myself. And, to say I wasn't putting in 100 hours a week, that would be a lie. I absolutely was living in this space. And I do remember, when you guys came in for that event, and I knew what was going on, but man, I had absolutely no bandwidth.
For sure. Well, your wife is a saint.
She is. She's amazing.
Let's talk about the beer itself. You mentioned Hop Fu. I was just talking to Joe Stanger, our managing editor, before we started up here, and he was mentioning that he met up with Beth Demon and her husband when they were out in San Diego and drank Hop Fu in your tap room. I love that this beer has just, been this kind of through line from your home brewing into your professional career. Before we talk about how you brew those beers, the most common complaint about hard seltzers: they need more flavor. Extract alone is a weak flavoring agent and can leave a chemical aftertaste. But there's a better way. The craft concentrate blends from Old Orchard are packed with real fruit first, no added sugars, and just enough natural flavor. Breweries are turning to Old Orchard concentrates for seltzer with more body, color, and aroma. Turn seltzer skeptics into supporters with seltzer that drinks like a beer. Get started at www.oldorchard.com/brewer. Also, still emptying those overflowing waste bins of crushed low fills or undercarbonated cans every canning day? It's time to fill like a pro. Pro Fill can fillers from ProBrew use rotary true counterpressure gravity filling and seaming technology to run at speeds of 100 to 300 cans per minute with minimal DO pickup. Stop wasting perfectly good beer. Email ProBrew at contact@probrew.com today. So, Kelsey, clearly you've won a whole mess of awards on the homebrew scale. You won programs, you've brewed with Stone, you've got all this stuff going on. You open up your own, commercial brewery, but now you're playing with the big boys and you're competing against some of those folks that you've been, brewing in a very friendly way with before. And I shouldn't say that, because all of this world of craft beer is both competitive and cooperative. The key feature of craft beer is helping everyone get better at doing this so that the entire world of craft beer is more compelling for consumers. But nonetheless, in the San Diego market, being an IPA hoppy beer brewer and going commercial means there's an immense expectations on you. And if you're gonna make any kind of mark whatsoever, you don't just have to be damn good. I mean, you really have to be next level. Talk to me about how you then took those recipes that you had been honing and were familiar with, figured out how to brew them at a commercial scale, and then set about trying to turn those into things that were going to be game changers for consumers and create a name for you on that kind of commercial world. I mean, the expectation had to be huge and the opportunity to fail was pretty big there.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely resonate with the opportunity to fail. Right out of the gate, I felt like I had done my homework. I talked to, a lot of other brewers who had scaled up, and I felt like I really understood the mechanics of, okay, I can take this 10-barrel batch and I can turn it into 15 barrels and it's going to work. I'd say the first several turns on our system, everything was crushingly bitter, and didn't expect it. Just the hop utilization rate when you go up to and we're on a direct fired system, so that
Sure.
hop utilization is going to be pretty gnarly. So getting some things as far as the balance dialed in, I'd say was that was pretty quick. I'd say within 6 months we were making beers that were they were solid, they were good. But I'd say that in the overall mix of like beers in San Diego, I don't know that we were necessarily wowing anybody at that point. And it's interesting because, as a brewer, I consider myself to be, pretty meticulous and very detail oriented. But when you are the proprietor and you're the head brewer and you've always kind of shorted yourself on help in the brew house, there's only, it's not that one thing suffers, it's that it all suffers a little bit because you're spreading yourself too thin. And that, I don't feel like we really hit our stride until I realized that it was far more valuable to our beer, especially if I take a step back and manage that process more than, have my hands in it.
Sure.
And so, we had some successes along the way. 2017 was really cool for me because, we pulled a bronze medal for our Bohemian Pilt, which I thought was amazing accomplishment because obviously beers like that are very challenging to make. And then let alone, impress judges to the point where they're going to put some hardware on it. And it's a style that I really like to make. But coming back to, IPAs, I feel like we didn't really hit our stride until, our beers, again, I felt I was proud of what we were doing, but I wasn't feeling like our beers are really impressing people the way that I want them to, and it was kind of I don't know, there's one competition in particular, and I don't mean to overvalue competition. It's not everything, but the one competition that I think is a really big one in California is the LA IPA Fest. And I participated in that a couple of years before we ultimately won it in 2020 with a beer called Sort of Mostly Dead. And that particular event there's something like 50 or so entries. All the judges are brewers from California, and it's all the best brewers. It's like all the best IPA brewers, and it's a West Coast competition. It's not haze, and it's you've got Tim from Cellarmaker and Evan Price and Bob Coons and Jeff Bagby and Julian Trego and Peter Hoey and Matt Brynildson, and from time to time the cast of judges changes every year a little bit, but it's like there's a lot of usual suspects in there.
All of those hacks, huh? Yeah.
You don't get a score sheet. You don't get feedback from this event, and so you only get the results, and but the real learned thing about that event is you can if you attend it, you can taste all these beers against your own, and kind of see, and then you see which one wins, and you understand why it wins, not just because it's a fucking amazing beer. It's also because when you compare it to yours, you're not doing it right. When we won it, that was applying like 2 years of stuff that I had just amalgamated, as far as sort of new school IPA techniques. A lot of the things I was doing with Hop Fu in particular were a bit antiquated, very BJCP style guidelines. BJCP is not constantly updated to reflect current, market conditions, so to speak. And so it was kind of relearning how to make IPA all over again. And then, I feel like the pandemic set in. We turned our tasting room off because we had to. And then it was like, all I have to do right now is focus on making really good beer, putting it in the package, and getting it into as many hands as possible. And I think our beers just improved like exponentially. And it's kind of weird. It's like nobody wants to look back on the time of the pandemic and say that there's a silver lining or anything good about it, because it's horrible.
Yeah.
About nothing worse has ever happened in my lifetime. And at the same time, I was just able to really hone in on what brewing is at its core and not have to worry about anything else in my business. And it made just such a huge difference. And did a lot of networking. We couldn't get together and collab with friends, but we talked to friends and find out more about new stuff they're trying and things that we're trying. With different hop products and different hopping rates and hopping methods and different recirculating hops in a tank versus rousing or not anything at all, and how do you do it and how do I do it, and just kind of like improved everything as much as we could.
It is, and again, this is not to take anything away from the death and significant toll that COVID has had on the world as a whole, but there are those small positives that we can take away from this. I think that when we look back at this 10 years from now, especially in the brewing world, there's just some of those, there have been critical moves that have happened over the last 2 years because of this. The explosion in lager brewing, I think you can directly trace to breweries having more time in tanks for beers and more time to try beers that didn't have to be immediate commercial successes or fill tap lines. And certainly then be having a little more time and space to not just focus on putting out the next fire, but instead there were still plenty of fires to put out, but thanks to, there's a whole, it's going to be interesting to look back at this. I think we're still too close to it to fully, understand all of the implications of it, but that's actually pretty wild. Talk to me about some of those ways from that 2019, 2020, kind of era where you fixed, or I shouldn't say fixed because they weren't broken, but modernized your IPAs, kind of brought them into this current context. Talk to me about some of those key moves that you focused on and trying to make sure that your West Coast IPAs in particular were addressing the current context of West Coast IPA.
Yeah, a lot of it was application of hops, thinking more about, our grain bill. It's funny, like back in my homebrew days.
Those are super broad ways to just say that. Let's talk.
Yeah, but yeah. I'll delve into it.
Okay.
But like back in my homebrew days, I always had these recipes that I never made that were like all pilsner malt, kind of malt, get out of the way and put the hops on top. And I didn't make a lot of those beers back then because they wouldn't have really worked in a BJCP context. Like they wouldn't win me any awards.
And your access to quality of ingredients as a home brewer is a little different than your access to ingredient quality as a pro brewer.
Definitely. But it's funny because I had some of these ideas like back then, but I never really did anything with them. And then as I kind of start delving into the modernization of IPA, it's like, seeing what guys like Bob and Evan are doing with their IPAs, it's like, it's all Pilsner malt based. And I'm like, okay, well, that makes a lot of sense. And it goes back to some sensibilities that I had that maybe if we can just get that malt out of there, that platform for hops can just be, that much more impressive. And then, the old school approach of, okay, we've got, a first word edition and a 60-minute edition and probably a 30-minute edition and 15 and a, flame out, all that stuff. My approach lately has been like, let's not cook the hop so much. And some of that comes from, our honing in on trying to make better hazy IPAs. So, we're very...
Wait. Now you're saying that your brewing hazy IPAs has improved your West Coast IPAs?
I 100% would say that. Yeah, no, like the notion of doing, low temperature hop stand in the kettle, You know, some of our West Coast IPAs might get like a very gentle first wort or a 60-minute addition, but then we may not add any more hops until we're at like 170 degrees. And those beers, you know, are incredibly popular. They still have enough bitterness from that very early hop addition, but we're getting, you know, so much more, you know, just fruit forward notes, and you know, we're not getting these really kind of deep, I guess, infused flavors that you get from boiling the hops. And then it's really been like all those mid additions, let's pull those out and throw them into the fermenter, you know. And we've cranked our West Coast dry hop rates, you know, we're north of 4, you know, on a lot of them.
Wow.
And some of, you know, pretty much every single IPA for us, whether it says it on the label or not, is double dry hopped. And, you know, like the Imperial IPA that we medaled with at GABF this year, Army of the Kinda Deadish, which is the imperialized version of our sort of mostly dead. Yeah, I mean, that beer's, you know, north of 5 pounds per barrel in the dry hop. And, you know, 2-stage dry hop. We do spin the tank a couple days after the second dry hop, so we're really resuspending hops in a major way. And
How long for each of those dry hop regimens?
um,
And I love
so
that you describe it as 2-stage, because I was going to ask you that one.
yeah,
Well,
we're
how
kind of
you define double dry hopped?
right. I mean, double dry hop for me isn't always 2x, but it does mean that we're splitting up. But some would say, you know, okay, well, a standard West Coast IPA dry hop's probably in the, you know, 2.5 to 3 pounds per barrel, I think, by most standards. So we, you know, when we're in north of 4, I mean, I think it's pretty easy to say that is pretty close to double the amount. But yeah, we'll usually do a gentle hop addition when we're close to terminal gravity, like 1 degree Plato away. And a lot of times that'll be like cryo hops. And then we'll do our
Why
big,
why cryo hops?
just looking, you know, there's a lot less vegetal matter in there, and trying to not oversaturate with polyphenols. We get plenty of that when we do that recirculation. So really just trying to keep the vegetal matter out early so that the beer doesn't have extended contact time on all of those vegetal components. And then so we'll do that like a degree Plato away from terminal gravity, and then a couple days later we'll go ahead and hit it with the like major amount of the dry hop, which could be like 80% of the dry hop at that point. And then usually the next day we'll do the recirc, and then we'll crash it the following day. So it's a pretty short dry hop. Usually it's you know, from first dry hop to crash, it's like 4 days.
And you pump then? You're not you know, just bubbling up?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's our 2 most recent tanks that we bought, that we installed over the summer, actually, because we've become so fond of this recirculation method, they have an offset whirlpool arm set in the upper jacket of the tank. And so, you know, we're pulling out the bottom and, you know, recirculating through that side port. And it definitely creates a whirlpool. The way that our hops are settling out in those tanks, we could be using 6+ pounds per barrel, and we're getting the best yields out of those tanks versus, you know, our others. So there's definitely something to it. You know, we're on track with these 2 tanks added to do around 2,800 barrels of finished beer. You know, at our scale, we're just starting to contemplate things like getting a C-box and getting more dialed in with DO. We did buy a canning line, you know, early summer, that we've been using since. So our cans seem to be holding up, but as far as like testing against these recirculation practices, I'm not seeing any reason why it's problematic. When I talk to other brewers about it who are apprehensive about it, they always tell me that, oh, I tried that and my DOs shot up. Well, I'm not sure because I don't have that data, but at the same time, my beer seems to hold up very well once we package it, not really having those issues that, would lead me to believe we're getting a bunch of O2.
So you have some decent pumps and some decent seals, and however that is working for you, it seems to be working okay.
Yeah, I mean, we're using our CIP pump. We throw a pressure gauge on it periodically to make sure that the seals are actually holding, and yeah, everything works pretty well.
Cool. Well, I want to talk about hops and specific varieties and and how you kind of go about creating that, building that blend. Before we do that, this episode is brought to you by Mountain Rose Herbs, purveyors of the highest quality organic herbs, spices, and teas. Whether you want to add depth to your next golden triple with classic notes of cinnamon, pepper, and clove, or artfully layer exotic, zesty grains of paradise into a perfect ale, adding botanicals to your brewing is an easy way to customize a delicious flavor profile. Mountain Rose Herbs has been providing organic herbs and spices to chefs, herbalists, and dedicated brewers for more than 3 decades. Learn more at mountainroseherbs.com and get 10% off any and all orders with the code CRAFTBEER10. Also, as a brewery owner, you know how important it is to keep your machines running so you don't have to deal with the hassle caused by contamination, recalls, and downtime. Clarion makes food-grade lubricants to protect your equipment from the wear and tear that results in breakdowns that cut into your bottom line. Clarion gives you peace of mind so you can focus on what you do best, pouring out great tasting beverages. Learn more at www.clarionlubricants.com. So we've talked about some of the technical approaches to dry hopping and some of the ways that you've pushed everything later into whirlpool temperatures and whatnot. But I'm curious about thinking about hops themselves. Certainly over the last 5 years, last 10 years, last 15 years, remarkable changes have happened in the whole entire world of hops in terms of varieties, in terms of the way the hops are processed. And you've had a front row seat on watching that. Now in the professional world over the last 6 years, you've got to even see change within that time period. Talk to me especially, and let's keep it in the West Coast vein now, as you think about West Coast IPA, how some of the hops idea, blends, and means of using different types of hops from cryo to whole leaf to pellet to T45 or T90 or whatnot has started to shift, and where you are now seeing yourself going with those.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the alternative, versions of hops that we can get now, cryo, Lupomax, Incognito, Spectrum,
Salvo.
Yeah, I mean,
all of the
there's
flowable all products, right?
All that stuff. For me, anytime I see that, I'm like, that means I get to use more hops. And it's funny because a lot of these products are designed from the perspective of, we're trying to give you as a brewer more yield efficiency, and I'm like, no, that just means I get to pile on more. I
can crank up the flavor without getting the negative side effects of that. Sure.
Yeah. And we've embraced like all that stuff. We do use a lot of cryo. We if the hop's not available in cryo, but we can get it in Lupomax, we'll give that a try. We've really embraced Incognito in a different way. It was designed as a hot side product. We actually dry hop with it a lot.
What?
Yeah, I mean, that's been kind of in my back pocket for a while, but I don't know.
How do you dry hop with Incognito or like a flowable hops product like that?
You load it into the fermenter before you knock out.
Okay.
Yeah. And
I mean, just thinking about it in terms of temperature, because, it doesn't generally need heat in order to, be absorbed to flow through and be absorbed in a liquid.
So you knock out a barrel hot.
Okay.
And then you turn on the heat X.
Let me get this straight. You're knocking out hot into a fermenter that has this in it, and then pulling it back out of there through a heat X to get it back down to the right temperature?
No. No, you're knocking out a barrel hot, and then you turn on the heat X, and it'll bring the tank temp down, as you're knocking out.
Oh,
Just
okay.
that first little bit needs to get mixed up.
Oh, okay. Okay.
But yeah, I mean, we've tinkered around with all kinds of stuff along those lines. And
Well, so why, what's the difference in dry hopping with a product like Incognito, from a sensory perspective for you?
um, really, for me, so uh, sidestep, this whole idea kind of sprouted from a first collaboration we did with Scott Wood from Courtyard Brewing. Courtyard's a little brewery down in New Orleans, and Scott used to live out in San Diego before he moved there and opened his brewery. He was pushing into our collab to use varietal specific CO2 extract products in the kettle during the whirlpool specifically. And we did get character from that I hadn't experienced before, and I liked it. But I was like, when we would go and rinse out the kettle at the end of the process, I'd be like, well, none of like too much of this is still sitting here
Right,
in
right.
the kettle. And I like kept tinkering with devices to try and bring it further and further downstream. And it wasn't, and so, I mean, like we would load it into a hop back and run through the kettle and push it through the heat exchanger and, try and get it into the kettle, into the fermenter. And, we would find that when we'd run the CIP, because it hit the heat X, got cold, it just re-solidified. And then, our CIP liquid would turn green. And it's like, well, we didn't get that where it needed to go. And so it was just kind of like a pragmatic final approach to just load it into the fermenter and knock out a barrel hot. And that idea actually was when we brewed a collab with Tim and Connor from Cellar Maker. Tim was like, why don't we just throw it in the tank? And it was like, oh yeah, that makes sense.
I see what you're saying. When you say knock out a barrel hot, you mean the first barrel is going in hot, and then
Yeah.
you're
Then
activating the heat X
right.
to then
Yep.
bring the temperature down on the rest of everything that's going through there.
Yep.
That's
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah,
That's
it's
so smart.
interesting. And the flavor that you get, like when you start tasting, your samples a few days in, it's like it's already been dry hopped, and it doesn't come with all the baggage that you get when you've dumped a bunch of T90 in it, knocked out, or into your fermenter, like knocking out onto hop pellets. It's a much cleaner, like it still has a very intense like resinous burn to it, but by the time you get to the end of the fermentation cycle and you're crashed out and ready to package, all of that's kind of faded. But yeah,
And you get to enjoy all of that biotransformation that occurs in the process too, right?
for sure. And that's definitely, something that works obviously well in hazy IPA. But yeah, that was something that, took some other people's ideas and just tried to figure out how we could make it into something that yielded really cool results. So that was a fun one. And I mean, like, art is hard, and you wanted to stay West Coast, but I'll just say, like, for that beer, that's actually the first hop edition. And
art is hard is the hazy IPA that you won a silver medal for at GBF, just
correct.
so that everyone's following along okay on this one.
Yeah, yeah. So
that's the first hop edition for that.
Right. So there's actually nothing happening in the kettle for that beer.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
No, none. Not even in the whirlpool. No hops until you knock out hot into the fermenter with some Incognito.
Right.
Kelsey, you're crazy, but I love it. I love it. Let's talk about specific hops. Obviously, we think of them and have used this metaphor, quite a bit, that, hops are like paint pigments, and what you get to choose from is different now than it used to be. And even the quality of those is different now than it used to be. When it comes to some of these things, where do you find yourself, and even especially, there's expectations both in hazy IPA in terms of tropical citrus, et cetera, flavors. There's expectations in West Coast IPA in terms of dankness and bitterness, as well as that fruitiness. Where do you find yourself generally playing in that hop blend realm in terms of varieties?
Um, for me, it's, I try and take the approach of, okay, are we starting at counterpoint, or are we just trying to find some things that are complementary? And I always find that both of those things work. But sometimes it's like, okay, so I've got, this hop might bring sweet fruit. So I definitely want something with an edge to, some bite to it that's going to, contrast to that, so that we've got more complexity. That was like going back to Hop Fu. That beer and its selection of hops was always built around trying to create a very complex hop flavor profile that when you would read the style guideline for which it would be judged against, it would have, in that description, a lot of different flavors that could be included. My goal was to try and touch on all of those so that, the judge who's writing down those notes says, oh, there is citrus, there is pine, there are all of these different elements, and the beer is really well balanced, and matches up with, all of the style, not just a piece of it. And I kind of go into a lot of my, hop, when I'm putting together hops with that kind of approach. I always like there to be dimension. It's like if if it's just peach rings, like somebody might really like that, but I would want to offset that with a few other flavors so that we get that bowl of fruit instead of just that one thing. So I mean, yeah, it's really just about kind of building a layer of flavors.
Still, even though you think about this kind of balance, I know that there's some go-tos that you have to love, that you
Oh,
just have to love what they feed into those beers.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I
Let's talk
mean,
about it both a West Coast and then a hazy kind of realm.
okay.
What some of those, like those core favorites that start to define your approach to IPA become?
Well, I mean, for me, like historically was like Simcoe, Amarillo, and Columbus was like kind of my trio that Hop Fu was kind of built on. And then when Citra, hit the scene, I fell in love with Citra. And Citra is like one of those that I can put it in West Coast, I can put it in a hazy, and it's just always a really good base point. Mosaic, is another one for West Coast that I absolutely adore. I think it works well in hazy IPA too, but I just like that deep, like blueberry, just really nice resinous, component to it. And I love the way that a hop like Mosaic plays so well with like the passion fruit and cannabis notes of Strata. And you get the tropical fruit notes from Simcoe, and that citrusy bite, from Citra, like those four hops, that's like the West Coast quartet.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure.
And you can use a couple of them, you can use all of them, and then, old school stuff, like you can throw in the mix some Chinook, you get that really big pineapple-y, resiny bite. Centennial's always, a favorite. I've been really nerding out on the survivables data that's been coming
Sure,
out
sure.
from, and kind of seeing, like going back and reapplying things like, oh, try that on the hot side and just leave it out of the dry hop, and then, load up these guys in the dry hop, and some of that experimentation's been, pretty fruitful as far as the results go. So it's kind of cool
Pun
to,
pun intended.
yeah, 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 for sure. Yeah, I mean, like,
Specifically,
obviously,
that's changed the way that you're using certain hops and pushing some onto the hot side and some only onto the cold side now.
yeah, but I mean, like I was saying earlier, I'm more and more getting away from using hops that were boiling. Like a lot of hops
Yeah,
are going
yeah.
in at a colder, steep temperature when they do go in hot. Um, And I think a lot of that is just really honing in on our own house flavor. That's one thing that I like. And especially in a city like San Diego where we want to stand out, and be a little bit different than everybody else, we have to have beers that taste like ours. I feel like we're really coming into that.
And you think that it's this pushing towards cooler temperatures that is really helping make that happen for you?
I think that's part of it. And I think that, it's just some of our techniques, and, we're not a big distributing brewery. So we, like a home brewer has the luxury of kind of, overspending, so to speak, on processes. We kind of do the same. So, we push a lot more hops because we're not having to take such a big margin hit. And, that's part of our business model, is to set the quality as something that's core to what we do, and, experiment, try new things all the time. And, somebody once asked me in the supply chain, they were like, aren't you worried about your beer not being consistent batch to batch to batch? And I said, I'm only concerned about my beer being better and better and better. Like, if there is a place we can take this beer to the next level, that's what I want to do. I don't want to just say, okay, this recipe's done, let's move on. If there's room for improvement, we learn a new technique that might have an impact on every single recipe that we make that's a hoppy beer. And that's just how we continue to evolve.
It's definitely a truism that no consumer ever complained about beer getting better. There's not a single consumer that's like, oh, I just wish the beer was consistent, even if it was worse. If as long as it gets better, no one ever will complain. You're right.
Yeah. And, I keep coming back to Hop Fu. It was a very important beer for us to exist on, but that beer has changed. It changes all the time, and it's really just about the quality. The hop bill has always had the same hops in it, but they're used in different ways.
So that's the through line through it. And, because why not call it something else if it's different? Obviously, people know the brand. They have an expectation for it. They come and they want Hop Fu.
Well, just never make too many changes at once. It's always kind of a slow build. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's talk about hazy IPA, because I'm absolutely fascinated, in particular hazy IPA. So I'm fascinated, again, coming from San Diego. It's not a market that is necessarily loved or embraced hazy IPA. There are consumers for that in San Diego for sure. But then there's also a hefty brewer backlash against the idea of hazy IPA. And certainly you're in amongst some peers who have been a little curmudgeonly about that in some kind of ways. Nonetheless, you have done it, you've embraced it, you've found your own pathway forward to make hazy IPA that feels like a beer that North Park would make. Talk to me about how you envisioned hazy IPA in that kind of way, as coming from a brewery like North Park with the expectation around hoppy beers that comes with that.
So I didn't embrace the style at all, when it first started to trend in San Diego. But as a business person, you have to, give up some things at times. And I said, okay, we'll make a hazy. And our first approach was not good. I mean, it was basically just, okay, we'll add some oats to West Coast IPA grist. We'll still ferment it with Chico, Cal Ale, and we'll dry hop it about the same as we do anything else. And it's got a bunch of hop additions in the kettle. This was like 2017 when we did this. And that was Art is Hard, which became a core beer for us not long after, because even though that version of that beer sucked, and it was bitter and, wasn't what was the expectation in the San Diego market, that beer actually worked pretty well, because it was hazy, but it was more, what the beer drinkers locally were used to. It still had bitterness. It was
a bridge for them.
Right. But anybody who was seeking out a hazy would try it and they'd be like, oh, this is garbage. This is not what I was hoping. It's not juicy. It's not, it's not creamy. It's, it's missing all that, really big tropical fruit. And so, we just started iterating on it. And that beer was kind of, the name Art is Hard. There's a song by the band Cursive, and the song's kind of about like kind of, as an artist, you're constantly up against failure, and you have to, sink to swim, and all these concepts about, kind of as an artist, you're the art of acting weak, and you have to try and boost your sales, you have to do all these things that are maybe counter to your core. But that was kind of the idea, because I knew I was getting away from what me as a brewer wants to make. But then ultimately, as I actually tried some really great versions of the style, I said there is a target here that is an exceptional, style that really people absolutely love, and there are breweries that have made a massive, massive, footprint existing solely on those styles, and there's a reason for it. It's because they make them extraordinarily well, and there wasn't really a lot of that happening in San Diego. There were a couple of breweries that were doing it well, and I said, you know what, let's just figure it out. Let's dig in and start talking to the brewers that are doing this style, justice, and really learn what it takes to make, a world class, juicy New England style hazy IPA. And, just kept working on that recipe. And it took a lot of time. The hop, similar to hop foo, like I picked 3 hops that I thought would work well together. That one's Citra, Motueka, and Simcoe. And I really like that hop combo. I think it works really well in that beer. But, again, just kind of like pushed and pulled and put them into different slots in where we would hop with them. And ultimately the fermenter was where they all belonged. So, just iterate, and that's where we got.
What's the, and this is a regular IPA, not a double IPA. So it's right around the 7 mark. What's the total hop volume look like now? Obviously, if you're using hop products or, cryo hops of some sort, that's going to throw off our equivalency here.
Yeah, I mean, we're close to 5 pounds per barrel on that plus, and that includes cryo, but wouldn't include the incognito that we're using. So, there is that. We recently have been sprinkling a very, very small bitterness addition into some of our hazies, especially since we can so much now. So that one, while, the medal winning version did get, virtually nothing in the kettle, we're now adding like 10 BUs of bitterness with an early hop addition. We find that those beers hold on a little bit better in the can.
Interesting. So that actually improves the packaging performance of them.
I think so. Yeah, I find that our beers fall off and they get too soft after 4 weeks. But when they've got just a little bit of extra bitterness, they kind of hold. And I find that they're more pleasant to drink later, and they don't come across as particularly overly bittered, at the outset. So it's not compromising early, just might be a little bit more sharp, not in a bad way.
It's funny because when I was out in LA a couple months ago, had a conversation with a brewer out there who was saying the same exact thing on the lager side, that because they were focusing on packaging lagers, that amping up a little bit of bitterness in that, just because it was going into that kind of can format rather than draft, just helped them hold on and maintain some structure for a little bit longer. No, it's interesting to see just how the pandemic and the refocus on packaging has impacted that element of the brewing structure. With Artist Hard, how do you, clearly you've been successful with it. Clearly judges at GABF find that it resonates. What do you chalk that up to? What do you think it is about that beer that sets it apart?
Well, it's interesting because I think the beer judges are still grounded in American style IPA, West Coast, in particular. And if you would sit Artist Hard side by side with what we make these days as like a double or triple dry hopped hazy double IPA or triple IPA, tasting them next to each other, Artist Hard definitely still has a little bit more of a West Coast slant. It just comes off as drier, a little bit, less, residual sweetness. And the hop bite is, kind of the bitterness that a West Coast IPA would typically have. Whereas, these higher gravity versions are much smoother and, also have hop intensity that is massive from, triple dry hopping. But at the same time, there's just an element of thickness to how we make these higher gravity versions that Artist Hard doesn't have. And I think that some of that is why it appeals to the judges, because it's a little bit more familiar in terms of body, mouthfeel, texture. And then it still has the visual appearance that's expected for the style. It still has all the aroma. So I really think it's that. It's how we've put the recipe together that it appeals to the West Coast drinker, but it is absolutely it meets all the marks for a hazy.
And I think, obviously every competition you have to know your audience and know who the judges are. And because GABF and the World Beer Cup are judged by pro brewers,
right?
They're going to be making those kinds of selections. Having said that, I think what you say is also really interesting, that these hazy beers don't necessarily scale in a linear fashion, that there is almost this exponential jump when you get to that 8% double IPA or 10% triple hazy IPA level, where it's not just a simple move up. I mean, it becomes the opportunities with that alcohol, sweetness, bitterness, etc., just become even bigger than they are at that kind of single IPA level.
I totally agree. And the added alcohol from those obviously helps you pull more and more hop flavor out. It's all soluble there, and then you're just loading on hops and hops and hops, and so it's just so saturated. And while we're not light on the hops on the single, it's not the same rate at all. And I think that it would be cloyingly over the top if we went to the dry hopping rate that we would on those higher ABV beers in the lower ABV version. So
sure. Well, at the top, I mentioned that we would talk about barrel-aged beers, and we're getting on in time. I don't want to ignore that. Also, because I just somehow finished solo a 500 milliliter bottle of your barrel-aged stout and feel like we need to talk about it. Certainly.
I'm impressed, I got to say. I don't usually dome one of those myself.
I do not either. And, but I opened one up to start the podcast, and then we got pushed back a little bit, and I guess I'm just going to keep drinking this. So I did, and here we are. And I hope that I've grown even more animated as a result of that. We'll see. But let's talk about barrel-aged beer, because certainly amongst the world of beer geekdom, barrel-aged beers are maybe not the biggest commercial thing that you do. Far from it. They're a small piece of that, but they're certainly something that doing well helps create a reputation for your brewery. You have gone that direction. Your Before Dying series that you've extended in multiple ways with these barrel-aged stouts have made some waves, and they are delicious beers. But let's talk a little bit about how you create a North Park approach to barrel-aged beer.
Some of that's happy accidents. The first.
There's no happy accidents. No.
The first Death Before Dying beer that we did was an attempt at the highest gravity stout that we had done, which by today's standards wasn't super high. It was like 32.5 Plato, which seemed really high to me at the time. And I'm looking at this from the old Russian imperial stouts I would make as a home brewer, and they were all pretty well attenuated. And this beer just crapped out early, and it was, for my palate, it was super sweet, and it was just over the top, and not something that I typically would like to drink. But man, was it the right base beer to put in barrels? And so, it wasn't like, this didn't work out, I'm going to send it down the drain. It was like, well, it's very thick. It has a lot of residual sweetness, but it still has a lot of good qualities to it, but it's just so out of balance. It needs some bourbon to cut through it. And so that was the first version that we put in barrels, and that turned into the first 6 releases of the Death Before Dying series that we did. But it was a light bulb moment when we finally got to tasting those barrels once they had matured, and it was like, oh wow, like this is exceptional. And at that point, I hadn't really done collabs with, other brewers who were making, these massively high gravity stouts with these really, really ridiculously high finishing gravities. And, it was kind of like, okay, we're onto something. As far as approach wise goes, I mean, I've always, if it's a stout, it's got some roast in it. Usually there's a sprinkling of black patent as well, but it's always got a pretty big range of chocolate malts. And, these days we're using more and more dehusked malts, whether it be carafas, black prince, or love chocolate wheat and chocolate rye. Pale chocolate is a favorite. But usually these recipes end up being kind of it starts with a good base malt, like a Maris Otter. It's got a bridge of crystal malts, that may go as high as like double roasted crystal DRC. And then it's going to have, either very focused on a couple of chocolate malts or a chocolate wheat or a chocolate rye, or it's going to have kind of another bridge of roasted grains in there. And a lot of it is still a work in progress, trying to learn about, what adjuncts might play well with the grain bill that we pick, or, I love good bourbon, but by no means am I very well educated on it. When I have a good one, I know what I like.
Sure.
And we've had the pleasure of using some nice barrels like Blanton's and some of the more sought after bourbons when we can get them. But I'm also a fan of things like Heaven Hill, or we just tasted a series of barrels and a chocolate rye imperial stout that came out of a Heaven Hill rye barrel. Like the whole set of the barrels was just wonderful, and they're all going to be, a great base for a bunch of bottles. We are actually ramping up our bottling efforts. We're looking to try and do about 2 bottles a month next year, which is a big jump from what we've been doing, which is usually just a couple releases a quarter. But we just added another assistant brewer to our staff so that our lead brewer could start heading up a special projects effort to get a lot more bottled beer going out.
Interesting. So you mentioned that going in at such a high gravity was really impactful through that barrel process. And that's certainly something that I hear over and over again. And had a great conversation with Jim and Marty from Revolution. They had the same kind of thing. Happy accident with really high gravity, very sweet, under attenuated beer that went into barrels and had a wonderful impact through that barrel aging process, just because it tends to hold up better over that kind of time. Where do you tend to go into barrels now in terms of Plato?
Usually we're in the 14 to 16 range. We've had some stuff go in that's way north of that.
Sure.
We did a collab with Three Sons recently, and that beer finished at 20. And it was 42 to start. So it's a big boy. And that's kind of the top for us so far. We haven't done anything bigger than that. We've collabed with Horace, and we did one that through a bunch of feedings in the fermenter had a theoretical, original of 42. So kind of neck and neck with that Three Sons as far as the top, but that one went into barrels at 19.6. So yeah, I mean, big. And we've had stuff go into barrels, in the 12 Plato range. And for me, now that we're really starting, we have like almost 60 barrels in our basement, which for our spot, you've been here. You haven't seen our basement, but it's not huge. It's 1,400
It sounds
square feet.
crowded to me. Yeah.
Yeah. 60 barrels is about the max. But now that we're starting to develop good barrel stock and we're going to start blending a lot more instead of doing single barrel releases, a lot of these sort of thinner, which they're technically not really thin, but these thinner stouts really pull that barrel character. And I think it's going to make for a nice blending component with some of these super high gravity ones. Where they might have too much in the base beer that's just really preventing it from pulling in, a lot because they're just so dense. But these thinner ones really pick up that barrel. So I think once we can start nerding out with this new effort to do more things, it's going to get really exciting.
Bringing those two things together. That's fantastic. Let's zoom out as we finish up here. Thinking about the big picture, what's success look like for you and for North Park? What's the goal for the brewery, and when will you know that you've achieved it?
I mean, we're on the path to success. This year's been our best year yet, both in terms of just like pure enjoyment of operating this brewery, and also, being seeing some cash hit in the bottom line, which is great. We've seen
some peer recognition in terms of medals as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I'm all about that. I love that stuff, and we're just looking to keep growing in smart ways, trying to keep a small brewery mentality as we grow. I never want like a commodities brand, I don't really want to stay out of grocery stores and things like that. We're very much set on a direct to consumer, experience. Tap rooms for us is kind of our growth plan, and we'll have to build more breweries, to continue to supply that. We'll keep packaging, but making cans that we can sell, direct, and make sure that we're maintaining that quality focus. We'll be opening a satellite tap room next summer. Locally in the Bankers Hill area near Balboa Park. So
cool.
Looking forward to that.
So North Park becomes North Park Plus.
Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. For nearly 30 years, G&D Chillers has set the mark for quality equipment you can rely on. BSG brings the best malt, hops, and additives from around the world to your brew house. Craft concentrate blends from Old Orchard are packed with real fruit first. It's time to fill like a pro with ProFill can fillers from ProBrew. Get 10% off your next order from Mountain Rose Herbs with code CRAFTBEER10 and make your system 100% food safe with Clarion lubricants. If you'd like to support this podcast, go to beerandbrewing.com. Click on that subscribe button. We bring you great brewing content from some of the world's most inspiring brewers, and our all-access subscriptions bundle magazines with exclusive digital content and video classes you can't find anywhere else. Kelsey, if people want to learn more about North Park, where do they find you all?
So you can hop over to our website, northparkbeerco.com. On Instagram and Facebook, our handles are at North Park Beer Co. And Twitter as well. We're not too active over there. On IG, if you are going to follow us, make sure you click that little alarm bell and subscribe. We've had a bunch of shadow ban stuff going on, which that's probably a whole other episode.
Oh man, the breweries are seeing that left and right now, huh?
Oh yeah, it's really brutal.
When you build on rented land and use other people's social media platforms, you don't call the shots. Then we, like all of us, we just get to pay those platforms to access the same people that liked us already. It's a whole mess. Well, I hope everybody listening gets a chance to try Artist Hard, gets a chance to try your West Coast IPAs, and certainly gets a chance to try some of your barrel-aged beers, because they're all wonderful things, and I've enjoyed greatly drinking and discussing those. Kelsey, thanks for joining me on the podcast. Cheers.
Cheers, Jamie. This is awesome. Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com, or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.